Hi YouTube, author-philosopher Ronald E. Springer here. I've decided to release Disc 7 of Moral Armor's flagship program, Sovereignty, as it is particularly relevant in today's world. I've enjoyed watching the fight against the left, specifically the social justice warriors. Those involved have been handling it brilliantly. Blonde in the Belly of the Beast, Gavin McInnes, Stefan Molyneux, Roaming Millennial, Ben Shapiro, Lauren Southern, Karen Strohan, Milo Yiannopoulos. So much more fun listening to you guys than anyone else in the major media. With a worldwide audience of the web, we're watching clueless kids go through political puberty in the most embarrassing way possible. Most of what they push is based on irrational fantasy, but even if our well-educated and experienced arguments are crystal clear, it makes no difference to the worst of them. Why is that? What I'd like to share with everyone is that their mindset is nothing new. There's a pattern to it, and the pattern recurs in every irrational mentality under the sun, at all levels, all throughout history. As Moral Armor describes, and the best of us practice implicitly, there is a pattern to cognition itself, a moral pattern to thought, which they violate completely. But most SJWs aren't even dangerous yet. Ignorant of history, they often don't recognize where their pattern leads. I want you to have this knowledge as ammunition for the next wave, when the mindset of those most dedicated becomes truly lethal. There is a cognitive pattern of good and a corresponding pattern of evil, and both are very predictable. It's time to make the sides clear. Of course, this is the ultimate power struggle. As I see it, mass awareness of this simple structure is the key for the moral transformation of mankind. Identifying the moral pattern of life is my greatest pride. Identifying the pattern of evil is my life's revenge against those imposing it. Exposing them and laughing about their living incompetence is the revenge of the fittest. With that, I give you Disc 7 of my 12 CD set, Sovereignty, titled The Spirit Murderers, Part 1.
Hi, this is author-philosopher Ronald E. Springer. Welcome to Disc 7 of Sovereignty, Fear-Driven Man. Part 1, Denial of Existence, Concepts of Blindness. Evildoers are easier, and they taste better. Interview with a vampire. Hell. Having seen the world of Atlantis, where rationality shines and the best in all men is rewarded, we've acquired the weapons to remain untouchable. We've grown strong by the knowledge, and now we're ready for our journey into the underworld. This can be a descent into madness for the unprepared. Conditions exist here that decent people should never have to see. But with our armor, we'll traverse it in relative safety. Stay close. Often we imagine hell to be a great cavern of jagged rock and fire, dangerous but exciting to a higher power just the same, but that's not the true nature of hell. Imagine forging this great blade, honing this muscular body, then being sat down in a dirty, cold waiting room with 60s decor, staring at a green wall for hours. True hell doesn't require armor plate to endure, but rubber gloves and clothespins. Hell is immobility, being held back by personal choice, culture, or legislation. Hell is contemplating wonders forever denied to us, dreams never to be reached, happenings that will never happen. Hell is contamination, the infiltration of filth and pestilence allowed to spread uncontested. It's disease left untreated, disease welcomed, if you will. Hell is where others dictate your course, yet remain unaccountable. Hell is patiently trying to reason with the unreasonable. Hell is doing 35 miles an hour when we could be doing 80. It's the energy of life drained and gone, lethargic eyes too drawn to stay open, and the ill-smelling bum who lacks the common decency to wash. Hell is seeing our lives consumed, not to serve our highest ability, but to serve that bum. Hell is where high spirit is not fostered and cannot be sustained. Hell is where the cards are stacked in the favor of evil, where emphasis is placed on alleviating the burdens of stagnation versus protecting the foundations of growth. Hell is helplessness, where our comprehension is blurred and our bodies are crippled. Hell is the decay of mind and body, the death of dreams, the offensive contraction of every sense, and the defeat of every rational premise. It's where we must never set up camp. Hell is watching our living power wasted, who knows why. True hell is boredom, 24 hours a day. Not what you expected? Well, no kidding. Hell is where we lose. That, of course, is hell from the viewpoint of a self-made man, a man of great capacity forced to sit on his energy. But while it limits us, it allows another type of man full reign in the use of his capacity. It allows him to posture as leader in place of those who deserve to be. It allows him to invert the only sound class structure of man, sound motive versus unsound motive, and to invert human guidance, taking control away from the most complex thinkers and giving it to the least. Like rats roving over a corpse, it restrains his prey, allowing him to negate cause and effect and to check ability, undermining the best moral minds in favor of those with the lowest immoral aspirations. This hell exists all around us today and is desired by that type of man. Where does such a man come from? Why does he want to reverse everything? What advantages does he gain? The tragedy of submission. Hell from the view of a fear-driven man is existence itself. Early on, some men suffer a panic attack against the very responsibility of vision and coherence. Perhaps upon opening his eyes and realizing an effort on his part is required to focus and to distinguish sounds, certain of his own inadequacy, he freezes. Utterly helpless in this warped, blurry world, the vibration he feels as the very undercurrent of existence is a life-threatening intimidation. Unable to back out of his basic obligations imposed by life, with fear growing at an almost audible pace, it's too much. His terror of self-chosen action becomes so total that he claws towards any means of its avoidance. He runs cognitively, ingraining a behavioral pattern of constant disengagement, and ends up only able and willing to see the world through the eyes and minds of others. A dependency is an outside condition without which an entity cannot live, and a man's first dependency is upon those who sustain him. Beginning as a natural condition to be shed upon self-establishment, fear-driven man bucks nature and intends no separation. Sentiment is his lifeblood and must be monitored carefully. To be pleasing to others is a life or death subject to him, and he negates his own choice to the point to where, if put into words, you'd hear him say, "Tell me, does this feel good or bad to me? Do I like this? Or are we against it?" When alone, he faces an abyss, a void of identity, so he cannot be alone. He must exist within others, as with nature denied and consciousness negated, no other form of identity exists. Sentiment begins as his view of himself held by others, and becomes his view of existence held by others. With life seen only second-hand, men become the first axiom of his existence, and all of his primary standards become social. For other fear-driven, it was cemented years later, forced into submission by those holding a greater physical power. They were bullied most often when looking up to adults for guidance and truth, and instead found themselves subjected to violence for a host of reasons. The awareness of what they weren't supposed to acknowledge, innocent questioning in the presence of denial, all squashed by crude adults threatened by the honesty of a child. On one side, he sees a malevolent universe which holds some dark, unknown peril at every sensation. On the other, he sees a menacing force much greater than his own, with no rationale to guide it. Reason clearly is not on the winning side. Stuck between the incapacity to face existence and men who disallow the process anyway, unable to deal with either, he gives in and uses his tools only enough to evade what he perceives as a danger. As his first enemy is existence, his second becomes consciousness. Consciousness being the inescapable link to his first enemy and his only means to direct his illusion, he uses it to pull a barrier between himself and existence. The barrier can only be his third enemy, other men. He chooses to side with the least of these evils, the penalty he knows, subhuman brutality. He must face existence or man to pursue his sustenance, and with existence an unknown road, the road of deceitful appeasement is provided by those demanding his submission. As he is motivated by fear and others attempt to motivate him by fear, his conclusion is inherently confirmed. The submission-domination axis has in his mind become inescapable and therefore axiomatic. The fundamental axioms of existence and consciousness have been replaced by the substitutes of men and their coercive relation to one another. Instead of independence, he looks forward to the day when he will be the dominant force and will no longer need to be afraid. Of course, he doesn't realize that his highest aspiration has been chosen by fear itself, whose tenets will henceforth rule his destiny. A Fool's Paradise, the Birth of Altruism. Men are not born spirit murderers. It's an identity that fear-dominated minds assume upon acquiring some sense of physical potency in the successful disregard of existence. Grasping blindly for a substitute driver of his intellect, fear-driven man turns his focus to the task of securing a stranglehold on those who did not appear to default. He finds his home in a substructure that was prepared by other cowards over time, a societal structure requiring no mental effort, only obedience. In exchange for his servility, he gets protection from reality, which keeps him safely anonymous among the pack. Disconnected from self-support, the main activity of his mind becomes his limitless imagination. As the better men abandon such quests for unreason early, those who remain encourage it, fostering his distance from reality. To his relief, the natural world need not be obeyed or even considered, as he can attain his desires through these others, handed to him without causation. This allows him to disavow the world he fears, and disassociated, he looks at the world without dread for the first time. In his world, everything is free, treats fall into his hands from the sky, the atmosphere is set for his pleasure, his subjects bow to him, and endless luxuries exist for his delight. He can claim that by nature, nothing is to be expected of him, that thought and its benefits should be automatic, that life should be provided to all as a minimum and require no effort. His guardians applaud his description of their heaven, and all his effort towards these values in real life stops. He receives love and acceptance without relation to his actions, and the traits he sees in others that cannot be had without effort, strength, ability, bravery, his guardians assure him are unimportant and without consequence, the products of luck. With all values being automatic, all of his guilt can be shed or reversed. He can now conclude that those engaging in effort are the ones lost in folly, and he can safely look down on them. There's only one problem with this world. It isn't real. Ultimately, none of it works. It seems to at home, but in the real world, the active, courageous boy wins the race, saves the day, and gets the girl. The real world doesn't acknowledge his illusions. Here, there's no pride without achievement, there's no love without personal value, and there's no life without effort. The girl he has a crush on doesn't even know he exists. She has a crush on the boy whom his guardian's every statement has been designed to condemn. Why would she want him, he asks. Lied to and weakened by those closest, including himself, he isn't prepared to compete on wholesome grounds. He ends up thankful that the girl doesn't like him, intimidated by what her expectations would reveal. From the beginning, his successful escape from responsibility achieved no esteem at all, but only left a void where esteem should have been. No matter what his inner world redefines truth as, authentic standards prevail in every endeavor. The smartest go the farthest, the best-looking turn the most heads, and the most confident and capable draw the most respect. Dulled by evasion, grimaced in anger, and stifled by fear, his spiral has begun, where no happiness, pride, or significance can be conjured, only bland safety. He knows he isn't really living. He can even acknowledge that those who help him maintain his front are fakes, but he returns to them for the consolation the outer world withholds, solace for an irrational contempt. How to make a monster. Looking out at those who did not fall to the same fear, those capable of experiencing the spiritual rewards of living, pride, confidence, love, and happiness, he witnesses the way his dream girl looks at her knight. He recognizes the virtues the knight represents, and ultimately stares inward with the lost eyes of his greatest heartache. He sees that not having the traits of strength, bravery, and ability do hold consequences, consequences too terrible to contemplate. He admits, "That's what I could have been. All it would take is..." And fear overcomes him once again in response to the forbidden word, independence. He must look away, or he'll realize what the good is for. His choice is either to acknowledge the highest and pursue its image, or to destroy the vision and any evidence of it. It's the destruction of life he chooses. He shrinks from the challenge. He cannot accept that the responsibility for its creation is his. He can't risk failure and lost pride pursuing new values when he must stand fast to preserve the image of his faked values. But he sees life being lived by dynamic people and cringes when he sees them win their dreams. No, he screams in the face of truth. He can't make unreality real, and he can't have what he wants, so he can't let it be possible for others. Instead of reverence for the good, he responds to his incapacity with so miserable a hatred that he turns his cognitive power to the task of corrupting every living concept. He chops up what's left of his rationality, separating cause from effect, virtue from choice, value from love, productivity from pride, and life from profit. He's not intent anymore on making the unworkable work, but on deliberate destruction of what does work. He discovers he's not the only one dissatisfied with reality. The contempt is widespread. He finds a way has already been paved to transfer his burdens to honorable shoulders through a collusive thought process developed against the productive by his fear-ridden predecessors. The battle has raged on for centuries between independent man desiring civility and those impotent to pursue values who require a blood sacrifice in every premise. His default has chosen his side, and he's taken under their wing. His youthful choices are rationalized by formal anti-concepts. He learns that his fear to venture out into the world was only his binding love for his family. His submission to others was the ideal of selflessness, and his treason against life in misguiding children was a noble sacrifice for nurturing their esteem. Masking that they live through others, they claim instead to live for others. They held their wounds up before the world to be healed, and through sympathy brought dependency into moral focus. Declaring this the highest moral premise, they demand that all be chained to all in an attempt to crush their prey by the very nature of their independence. In retaliation against existence and those able to deal with it, he learns to turn man's productive tools against them by infusing them with the same detrimental patterns that led to his own spiritual suicide. Now he's not irredeemable, but as reform opposes his every conscious premise, we must interact from a point of safety. Developing that safety requires that we learn and accept what he's known all along. In other words, know thine enemy. Part 2. Denial of Mind. Concepts of Irrationality. It's what people know about themselves inside that makes them afraid. High Plains Drifter. There was a reason our founding fathers said, "We hold these truths to be self-evident." The ancient spiritual conflict has been a battle for control of man's consciousness, and negation of mind is their primary tactic. The spirit murderers have undercut the self-made every step of the way to keep the genie of intellectual sovereignty in a bottle. Like every evolutionary step we've taken, it's a transitional phenomenon in human progress. Life always breaks free to cover new ground, overcoming all forms of oppression and limitation. This time our enemy is abstract, the hardest to detect, and therefore the hardest to kill. It lies within the minds of men, in the nature of the motives that drive every individual. Parallels of horror in moral thought. The best horror movies grip us not only by fear of bloodshed, but by suffocating the very essence of our capacity to live. They put us in situations where our senses are futile and often deceive us. In the darkness, our vision is lost. Every sound gives us away, and we dare not even breathe. There's no rationale in our killer and no stopping him. There's no shred of humanity we can appeal to, and no one to save us. Our minds cannot reason. The simplest choices result in drastic penalties. We fear every sight and sound, but wouldn't dare miss them. If we move, there's a penalty. If we stop, there's a penalty. To think is to face a terror too overwhelming to comprehend. So we run. We run without end, tired but don't dare sleep, hungry but can't hold anything down, cold, bleeding, reduced to a panting, quivering mass to be destroyed at any moment. Helpless, no action we take can get us out of harm's way. At some point our perceptions blur and we can't fight any longer. Reaching the exhausted agony that begs to be rid of this burden of life, we give up and wish to just have it end as painlessly as possible. This dread is at the heart of a fear-driven man, and as spirit murderer is the state to which he intends to bring you. There are many parallels between what elicits the deepest feelings of horror in human beings and the moral doctrines we've all been taught. Reading the Bible, you see the lures of unearned rewards, everlasting bliss, unlimited power over men and nature, and you get it all just for believing. Join us and your imagination reigns. In an uncertain realm, they promise the certainty of no judgment, no effort, and nothing to worry about. But life doesn't work that way. No man of esteem would want something for nothing. Freebies don't conjure that lecherous grasping reflex in us as it does in the fear-driven. These are benefits only a parasite would long for, someone afraid of living. But this is the pursuit of most moralities today, and their default is predictable. Evil itself follows a pattern of cognitive default, reversing the non-sacrificial code self-made man practices. The pattern of a fear-driven consciousness is, number 1, panic in response to existence, number 2, intellectual retraction or evasion, number 3, destructive action, and number 4, penalty. Fear is his target not to hit, but to avoid hitting, maneuvering to skim by unscathed. As he's always focused on fear, it's always near. The irrational wishes of a fear-driven man are at the root of every human evil at every level. Slavery, welfare, Nazism, white lies, all are ways around facing what one fears. Independent men need not make victims of others. The bloodiest regimes, the most savage crimes, and the painful lives of lost dreams all began with the helpless slug at their core. Death premises. A death premise is defined in that it produces no values, it only consumes them. It has no replenishing factors, ending in the detriment or death of the consumer to follow once the value is gone. The furtherance of a being by death pattern is parasitical by design, as it must seek conquest to sustain itself. Beginning as a self-esteem issue, the first purpose of a spirit murderer is to, number 1, evade that any initiative in life is possible to them. They deny the self-responsibilities of perception, identification, action, and validation in order to avoid the shame that would overrun their defenses if they didn't. They can't allow our work to result in the pride they've cut themselves off from, so their next intention is, number 2, to remove sanction from our productivity as being moral and right. They have to prove to themselves and to the world that the actions they fear to perform are devoid of moral value. That accomplished, they take the next step and declare them evil, which automatically declares the opposite of life-furthering action to be good. But as all human beings need material products in order to live, their third concern is, number 3, to secure a portion of our bounty for themselves. Our bounty is taken and consumed for their survival, the expropriation of which is disguised as a penalty to us for the sin of producing it. With their stomachs full and momentary safety established, they then intend, number 4, to make it impossible for us to produce any bounty at all. They know we'll continue to be human, so they'll make it as hard as possible, the vacuum of their esteem replaced with power, their pride replaced with malice. They clamp down wherever they can and dictate how things will be done, or else. But the nature of human progress doesn't recognize or else, and their aims are sometimes exposed for what they actually seek, a slave-master relationship. First they turn on themselves, then they turn on us. Without being too blunt, killing is their passion, and death is their goal. Deception. To lie is to confess one's own living impotence, the personal conviction that life can be faked, that there is an alternate world that harbors bountiful treasures, much greater and much easier than the one that exists. Lying shows one's preference for that world, a willing commitment to evade known facts in order to dance down the road of illusion, in pursuit of carrots which rationality forbids. The get-away-with-it mentality sees riches as a result of dropping his mind. Lies are a form of wealth to him, a way to be a coward and have the hero's bounty as well. The need to lie begins as a self-esteem issue. Valid self-esteem begins in a man simply by seeking the characteristics of existence that his mind is designed to identify, and that process cannot be faked. Such sensory evasion is a lie to life, a claim that these instruments bring not furtherance, but harm. It isn't true, and fear-driven man knows it. He knows that inadequacy in its use is what he fears, not the tool itself. The falsification of esteem is at the root of all lies, at the very root of spirit murder, and is the most disastrous practice as it makes all other human horrors possible. The essence of a spirit murderer and every element to be described in this section is about the cowardice of lying. Lying is proof of a cognitive dependency. One cannot lie to a rock or a tree, convince it that it's a loaf of bread or a house, and then benefit from the lie. One can only deceive a consciousness in an attempt to secure some undeserved value, even from one's own. White lies are the blackest, as they're delivered under the guise of friendship. They act as a wedge, separating the victim from his expressed ideal. All effort towards the proper value stops, as the victim is regarded as having reached it already. If he believes it, he is doomed to failure in attempting to display an attribute he doesn't have, competing with those who truly represent it. Believing he's in a different location on the road to his goal, with no chain of reason to tell him how he got there and no idea how to move forward, he no longer moves, and that's the end of values for him in that realm. Our fundamental worth and only value to others is our existential consonance, our bravery to see the truth, speak the truth, and live by it. Being truthful, there's nothing to remember, only the logical derivation of existence and their attributes. Lying just makes perception the enemy. When one attempts to live in defiance of truth, then truth becomes one's toxin. Lies mark our cognitive end in any realm, and where cognition stops, penalties start. A commitment to the unreal is the surest sign that someone should be committed. Reality is the last thing you want to have working against you. Self-made man cannot lie or fake. Reality is hard enough to keep straight. The hard-nosed image often criticized of the self-made is that he cannot be swayed with unreality. His intellectual power is not evil. It simply allows those who compromise no moral escape. He sees the long-term implications of choosing the wrong path and feels the twist of every knife in his unborn desires. We can lie to life, but life knows better and makes us pay. A soul is not sold in one dishonorable transaction or in one particular default of reason. It's doled out piecemeal in ounces of repression throughout life. The willingness to repress is to be convinced that one will lose a greater value in being truthful. But if the situation provokes repression, is that value truly greater? Self-made man knows better, often through painful experience, and will not build on any falsehood. Evasion of self-responsibility. Fear-driven man is not the creator of concepts or the identifier of attributes, so he starts by denying what has been identified by others. Having spent his entire life, from early development into adulthood, avoiding the whole concept of self, his first fundamental evasion is the realm of self-responsibility. Reflecting on his own actions, he considers the attributes of self to originate outside the self, alluding to every other conception as the source. With personal misgivings he wishes the external world would account for, the responsible parties are hand-picked according to expediency. God, destiny, other people, society, luck, genetics, past circumstances, all take their turn in the place of his guilt. His mental effort is spent to hide the possibility of having any choice in the matter. He actually wishes that the barriers he invents did exist, to remove the mature obligation to act. The self-made cannot fully conceive of or appreciate the power of his terror, and we're often left stunned when he plows through us to run the other way. It's no laughing matter. Self-reliance is his greatest fear. He will kill or die to avoid the responsibility of independence. Panic replaces his freedom to choose and wipes out any desire for that freedom. He'll tell you it's not his fault. Nature made him this way, and he has no choice. He can only use what he's given, and it's unfair if someone else was given more. He'd have you believe that at the precise moment Einstein's cerebral cortex was being developed, his mother ate a power bar. Because his own mother apparently didn't, he gets to ignore free will, personal effort, and rational discipline, and claim that the surplus of a productive man rightly belongs to him as well. If he can convince you that all human abilities cannot be chosen or earned, then his inaction poses no moral default. But if it were not for choice, there would be no thought and no science. There would be no progress, there would be no fun, and there would be no love. Choice gives us all a unique identity and allows us to build the value system by which we live. Ultimately, choice shows us exactly what people are. Consciousness is imagination. To the fear-driven, the content of the mind is soup, a mixture of chemicals not defined by conscious will, but defining conscious will, unreasoning drivers that prove he is not to blame, while simultaneously proving that achievers are not to be praised. The chemicals decide for him and determine his behavior, chemicals that are just there for some reason, whose existence or non-existence is to be juggled with diet or sleep, but never by self-discipline or any volitional consideration. His focus, then, is to conjure the chemicals that will make the right decisions, leading to prosperity in all things. He wishes to believe that the abstract world is a realm that never commits him to anything, but imagination is only one facet of cognition. In the self-made, there are many wonderful and varied actions of mind: evaluation, judgment, reflection, creation, discovery, and countless others. The spirit murderers have an immoral life-taking path for every one of them, which all funnel back to their causeless, effortless ideal. Be aware of it. But mostly a spirit murderer prefers to remain primitive, replacing all actions of consciousness with the one requiring no discipline, his limitless and therefore useless imagination. Sanction of the irrational. Even a self-made man's imagination has a productive intent, but the subject of purpose is foreign to the fear-driven. Spirit murderers aren't creators. They prefer to remain in the nearsighted, untaxing range immediately before them, unable to differentiate what's man-made from what's earthborn, unwilling to separate imagination from thought, and unable to think independently. Unconditioned for that tenacity, they stay focused on the pavement just before them. Exhausted by the simplest cognitive effort and in tantrum against being lost, they dance around saying, "See, la la la, I can get away with being irrational. It isn't killing me." And in that 20 seconds, they conclude that discipline, because it's not forced on them, is unnecessary for the rest of their lives as well. Thought is a realm outside the power of domination, and perhaps in rebellion against the oppression they've submitted to, they drop their minds, saying, "See, I have the power not to use it. That is my stamp of individuality." We all have that power, and it defines or defies our pride. They say, "Our guardians said that there were no answers, so that means that my non-answer can't be wrong." In defiance, they evict from their lives all those for whom there is an answer, and left to grope for self-esteem, wonder why their free rein against cognition is not resulting in any fulfillment. The truth is, what works for them doesn't work. They couldn't act like a fool in a job interview and get the job. They couldn't drive a car so carelessly and keep their license. Exclaiming what, in any practical avenue of life, will not bring rewards but harm, they try to run a life by such means, and as in all other realms, it results in nothing but penalties. You can witness the fear-driven impotence firsthand when a discussion about their course of action gets heated. The next time you hear, "That might work for you, but it won't work for me," ask, "How does your method work?" Blank stare. "What are the steps?" Looks at shoes. Their actual steps are, number 1, feel problems looming, number 2, evade them, and number 3, suffer. And they've earned it. Impotence of mind. The fear-driven rely on claims that the mind acts as a tool of distortion, not of precision. They frame our intellectual development throughout history as exploded fallacies instead of a positive view for what actually happens, greater precision for lives lived better and longer. As our knowledge and techniques advance, we reintegrate our data to provide more efficient and often revolutionary solutions. But reintegration, an essential facet of cognition, is most often used as an example of the futility of all knowledge. They say, with more experience, we know our conclusions will change again, so why waste time thinking we are correct right now? Stomping their feet because knowledge is not handed to them on a silver platter. They dance with glee when hearing of what's touted as a failure of science, a failure of man, and proof of his cognitive inadequacy. As the self-made seek confirmation of their life-furthering power, the fear-driven seek confirmation that it's hopeless. Comparing our tenacious progress to a perfect God, they attempt that automatic stature, claiming to be perfect, and then can do nothing to rattle that possibility. Asserting that perfection means never to slip on a banana peel, never to make a wrong move, to always look perfect without a word or a hair out of place, to face so immense an impossibility and maintain its image, they can't move. We as the self-made did not fix the results of our intellect, basing our worth on any single successful instance. We made no unnecessary presumptions about the world or about ourselves to live up to. We just kept working towards solutions. If we expected every experiment to work, there'd be no need to experiment. Most failures are not fatal. It's not a pride issue for a rational man. A pride issue for him would be to quit, or not try in the first place. But the fear-driven rejoice when we fall short, needing to believe that to try is as futile as doing nothing. They long to see their own worst view of themselves confirmed as a condition of all men, eager to paint the self-made as clowns to be laughed at. Could you imagine if Thomas Edison had to face a room full of spirit murderers, snickering, hooting, and hollering at every one of his 10,000 attempts? He'd be sitting in the dark right now. But eventually we succeed, and the floor drops out from under them once more. Self as a standard of evil. As the self is the medium through which all his pain is received and perceived, the self implicitly becomes his standard of evil. His risk of life and death are felt through his reliance on others. If others are pleased with him, he feels safe and gauges the quality of his life by the success of his placation. Never trusting himself to begin with, all the attributes of self are mistrusted, while he considers social actions as wholesome and superior. Sound civilization stair-steps from sound coherence to sound individual to productive groups of mature individuals. Still, self-hatred drives the spirit murderer to wipe out the individual. To cover their cowardice, they must destroy the possibility and moral value of individualism. They pretend that any action of the self is vulgar, improper, destructive, and at the extreme of their own capacity to deceive, to be insane. Self-esteem becomes a much more sensitive issue for those intent on faking it. Esteem being an inescapable necessity of life, its lack tortures him throughout his every day. In contrast, self-made man pays attention when esteem is ailing and works to remedy the causes to get himself back on track. It's the self that nags him day in and day out for values. It's the self that constantly wants and needs these things: food, water, warmth, love, stimulation, luxury, with no automatic way to achieve them. He hates the self because it doesn't relieve the need of esteem for free and never gives him a moment's rest. His only answer to the constant nagging of the self is to kill it. Self-denial, he calls it. It's so simple. He damns what he never intended to pursue in the first place. Their intention is to remove true morality from life, and morality in practice becomes the pursuit of evil, something a real human being cannot bear. This brings us to a philosophical rule. If men preach selflessness, selves will be destroyed. If they preach unconditional love, the conditions will be deplorable. There's no sacrifice in the world of the self-made, no blood drawn for others, and no blood drawn of others. In ours, the self as consciousness is all, to be nourished, fulfilled, and exalted. It's the entity which makes all further societal values possible, but not by its sacrifice, only through its fortification. Emotions as instinct. Fear-driven man prefers to believe that his emotional drivers are instinctual, as then no responsibilities need follow. He conditions himself to disengage proper cognition at any touch of fear, and negative emotions become his primary cognitive guide. Free will allows man the misuse of reason. That he can take the wrong road isn't a contradiction, but an essential attribute of choice, the basic determiner of his pride. Instead, he whines that the process to be natural must be automatic, that any chance stimulus must turn him in a life-furthering direction, leaving out the proper action of mind, evaluation. But human emotion is not the equivalent of an animal's instinct, and I'm beginning to believe that instinct itself is an invalid concept. Animals use sharp eyes, calculated agility, and peak awareness to stay alive, not the evasive eyes and lethargic stumbling of the fear-driven, trying to skirt responsibility. Animals use every advantage they have, and we have even more. We have sensory organs that gather information, a body that can carry us to pioneering discoveries, and an unlimited database we can build and reference. Emotion is only one gauge on the dashboard. It cannot assume the wheel. The power of choice is properly based on all elements of our human capacity: sensory data, knowledge, experience, and yes, emotion. And this defines our moral character, which in turn determines our physical and spiritual destiny and well-being. Our vast complexity makes possible to us a state of existence that animals cannot reach: the pride of choosing correctly, choosing life. Every new intellectual height has an emotional parallel waiting as a reward. By negating choice, fear-driven man can't even revert to being an animal. He becomes subhuman. Animals kill for their survival, broken into a few main reasons: to eat, for defense, and to eliminate the competition. Spirit murderers kill first and foremost to evade their own natures, a primal sin. The automatic functions of his body further his life as well. That's their purpose, and is the template nature has given us to follow. But no matter how much he'd prefer it, the mind is not one of them. The word human is a moral term, just as the word subhuman defines that state of existence which is immoral for man, but this is contextual. A man can operate morally in business, advancing a product, a human action, then go home and beat up his wife, a subhuman action. He can inspire a group, a human action, repress himself in a meeting with superiors, a subhuman action, and then take it out on a subordinate, another subhuman action. We all make constant choices, all of which are sources of life-furthering pride or of self-withering detriment. It's our responsibility to see every conscious choice serve the human side, the side of our sustenance, pride, and progress. Self-made man takes great pleasure in the process. To him, every choice of emotional control, judicious honor, and intellectual mastery is another opportunity to feel good about himself. Fear-driven man hates it, as such rational discipline is a complex action of self. He hates his own nature and makes choices only when no other alternative exists. He is tortured in the process, whether his action is correct or not, and whether he deserves a reward or not. To the extent that he negates his power of choice, he is a subhuman being. Exoskeletal frames of reference. With a world of proof to the contrary, the fear-driven exist as the only beings who see fit to consider the idea of their own universal impotence as a plausible and acceptable natural condition. Accepting his consciousness as imaginary and the whole of the world to be an indeterminate flux, he feels no grounding and seeks to steady his feet with the rules, conditions, and unquestionable authority of others. Since by his own estimation, nothing inside his skull is of any use, external frames of reference replace his middle cognitive actions, identification, and the creative actions of mind. His ideal, fervently pursued with a vigor to match ours, is to successfully remove choice from his life. If the choices are made for him by a source that can neither be doubted or questioned, then the responsibility has been shifted, and in his mind he's won his security. But the desire to negate choice is the inadvertent desire to wipe out morality. By attempting it, he's cut off from all the benefits which only moral action can provide: pride, confidence, enjoyment, and love. For the fear-driven, crutches are not temporary, but a permanent scaffolding for a building that never gets completed, though it's certainly finished. Fearing the power of another's consciousness, others are the first false frame he finds. We've all known people with so loose a grasp on their own rationality, so easily spooked, that they can be stopped by saying, "If you read that or listen to that music, you'll go to hell." They give you the deer-in-the-headlights look, the primitive terror of expecting some mystical force to descend upon them. To a human being with full control of consciousness, it's truly humiliating to witness. As we must accept or reject a premise to determine our moral stand, dropping their rationality negates their very moral responsibility. Others then sell him the second false frame in all its forms: faith. He is offered faith as a replacement for reason as driver. Religious, social, or otherwise, the thinking has been done for him. There's no need to confirm it or delve into its motivations. The question he poses is not, "Is it true?" but "How many people believe it?" The group accepts and rewards him for subjugating the painful process of thought, and their frames empower him to be creatively employed as a chauffeur, an excuse, a defense, an identity, a fall guy, and an alibi. Whether it's culture, peers, school, elders, authorities, political parties, or unions, he just desires anyone who will tell him what to do, and grant him the positive view of himself which his own sense of justice denies him. Exoskeletal frames of reference attempt to replace the internal frame that guides a man throughout his life. The fear-driven welcome it, while the innocent are bombarded with irrational hesitation throughout the spectrum of life. If you realize all that students must see through before they're permitted to view the world itself, religious doctrines, family obligations, collective requirements, educational, peer and authoritarian pretenses, social pressures, to be moral becomes to be without mind, without independence, and without sovereign identity. They end up with layer after layer of rules and regulations for living that so obscure and inhibit reality they can barely function. Stacked one after another directly in front of their vision, the weight of the burden is too great, and the decisions of their lives can no longer be managed. False frames are like Coke bottle glasses over 20/20 vision. Around false framers, you will find yourself stopped, trapped, your dreams and desires halted by senseless limitations and forced obedience to irrational demands. They attempt to rule the minds of others, the mind they fear and know not how to use. To interpose a man's judgment with that of others is to violate the nature of man, to suspend and restrict his tools of survival, and to leave him defenseless. Self-made man doesn't let anything stand in the way of the world and his view of it. We don't jump through hoops. We find our own way, practicing no formality beyond a strict intellectual discipline. Self-made man decides whether or not he agrees with prevailing principles, and regardless, chooses the path to life. He builds structures which allow the greatest number of options to remain open, accepting nothing that replaces cognitive action or inhibits the process. To the extent that outside principles are rational, he respects them. To the extent that they're unsound, he seeks to correct them. He is a man. He does not consider himself to be helplessly subject to another's limitations, stupidity, ill will, or parasitism. Rules for rational frames. Frames of reference aren't difficult to validate. Rule number 1. No frame of reference is valid whose verification of authority lies outside the range of your physical senses, outside your capacity to define, and outside your right to question. Since before the Inquisition, to question a moral authority's right to sacrifice your life has been considered heresy. This view has spread to include other hopeful benefactors of such homicidal altruistic principles, veiled by the claimed good of the family, the public, a state, or a nation. With their system of morality, they claim physical and spiritual values are only enjoyed if they're destroyed, and then proceed to confiscate your valuables, goals, dreams, money, and privacy, saying it's for your own good. No one holds that right over you, and no one ever will. Rule 2. No frame of reference is valid which relies on maintaining the immeasurable and the indeterminate as its purpose, its technique, its damage, or its reward, while naming a very specific cause, culprit, or benefactor. Cause and effect from purpose to fulfillment must be traceable. For example, faith has always claimed man to be evil by nature and granted God the esteem of all good, with proof of neither, concluding that man must be stopped. Sacrifice of individuals is a claimed historical necessity of a nation's welfare, for the children's futures, for protection against emerging enemies, for the purity of the Aryan race. No link of supposed cause to desired effect can ever be established. In our first steps of comprehending the enormous cycles of the earth, man-hating environmental protesters extrapolate straight-line calamity from every measurement taken. If the earth is cooler, we're headed straight for an ice age, and it's man's fault. If it's warmer, we're headed straight for an inferno, and again it's man's fault. Supposedly intervening to save this fragile planet, it isn't the problems they wish to solve, but the living actions of man they wish to stop. The course of every such crisis shows solutions provided by the men of thought and living action, never by the men of tantrum and demand. Rule 3. A frame of reference must have a valid context based on a human need for the standard, and all must rest on the fundamental axioms of existence and consciousness. Frames such as mathematics, science, and language are elements that foster and reinforce the power of the individual in dealing with nature. They aid him in the use of his consciousness, allowing complex evaluations with no outside interference. Rational laws such as the American Bill of Rights and self-governed capitalism protect him from the grasping subhumans who are unwilling to face nature alone. Proper frames of reference accent the individual's capabilities. They don't limit him or provoke dependencies. They lay a foundation that best allows men, by the nature of their physical attributes, to flourish. In essence, proper frames not only allow experimentation and discovery of better methods, they sanctify their pursuit. Still, many valid frames have been infused with self-defeating, human-limiting guidelines over the course of history. Capitalism, for one, has been beaten to death by those claiming its attributes to be exactly those of its antithesis, communism. Still, there's no duty required for each of us to approach these realms and sort them all out. It's up to you only to decipher the truths along strains that interest you, to follow what works and to discard the rest. In seeking your highest pride and enjoyment, you will have performed such a purification. Other avenues of life will be cleansed by those whose passion is likewise consumed in them. Putting spirit murderers in their own trap, if we are driven by God, our conditioning, or any other circumstances beyond our control, then our own private interests are the result of that affinity, and our proper course and highest efficiency is to pursue them. Their withered tree. The growth of a tree can be planned. Unneeded offshoots can be clipped to focus nutrients on a few select branches and on the trunk. Self-made man's accumulation of knowledge is identical. He furthers what's most important to him and trims the rest, until and if he decides to pursue the others as well. When he does, he has a much more stable base to work from, and the effort to accomplish the new task is small compared to the size, power, and efficiency of his system. His knowledge tree becomes like a redwood, wide and towering, shooting up to the heavens like an organic skyscraper. On the other side, fear-driven man rarely addresses the subject of his knowledge base, permitting it to be dictated to him by his outside frames. The result is a short, bushy thing, crowded with inessential offshoots that keep up appearances, but lead nowhere. So much energy is sapped in feeding the different snarls, little is left for expansion of the trunk. He has many trunks, much smaller and weaker than normal. Self-made man has one, consciousness, firmly rooted in the soil of existence. The fear-driven starts trunks according to every false source they believe is responsible for their lives: mysticism, wishes, family, peers, one for each outside frame of reference. Often what provides essential stability, the trunk of consciousness, is undernourished, becomes withered, and never bears its proper fruit, the emotional reward of self-worth. The others bear nothing but poison. Poorly rooted, eventually it breaks free, dries up, and tumbles with the wind, to be blown around as listlessly as it was created. Neurobiological facts still apply to those who reject self-determination, though one who negates his senses will receive less data through them. Ever notice how we associate larger pupils to honest, intelligent people, while evil is often portrayed and experienced with those having small pupils? Denial affects the senses as well, and they're less prone to let the light in. Within the range of their proper function, the senses will contract to avoid or expand to accept, according to our will. The full system energy of a fear-driven man is lessened by choice. His neural pathways leading to evasion and falsification grow the strongest, while those determining his minimum required effort follow. The pathways and connections which could make his experience of living so much more powerful remain thin, weak, and undifferentiated. He considers self-development impossible, the insuperable and forbidden sanctuary of luck, and so it remains. His subconscious, often claimed as the driver, still provides the only function possible to its nature, to automatize common elements of the conscious mind, leaving it free to integrate new information, or in his case, to disintegrate it. Ingrained with the practice of disengaging, these patterns become second nature, and denial becomes an automated subconscious attribute. Social standards become inseparable to his means of cognition, and non-essential frames become essential. Cut off from the higher reaches of his own intellect and from the most sacred emotional states, his mind is dimmed to twist and contort new data to suit his illusions, streamlining his own destruction. Preserving the indeterminate, anti-concept formation. Words do not command reality, but only describe it. They cannot be tailored to an individual's wishes or weaknesses, and they do not alter existence. They are as rigid as scientific measurements, and the more precise we are in their use, the brighter are the benefits they make possible. But to a spirit murderer, words are a way of stealing, an attempt to loot the value of a concept's true meaning by stretching it to cover what it doesn't actually describe. In most circles, anti-concepts exist unchallenged, spreading and perpetuating without resistance, and to the trained ear, their death rattle can be heard in every sentence. A concept is a mental integration of specific attributes. An anti-concept is a mental integration of variable attributes, subject to the interests of the wisher. It allows the user to hijack valuable concepts such as love, courage, and honor, and install his own defining characteristics. A definition that lets any attribute comprise a thing evicts it from the realm of identity, of measurement, and of focus. When anything defines a thing or a concept, it no longer exists. Anti-concept formation is the ultimate cognitive sin. It's not just the corruption of language, but of comprehension itself. In tribute to Aristotle, I call this A is anything. Spirit murderers intend to reverse and negate all attributes of man and existence by any means possible. As we stair-step up, they head back down with whatever we've created. They've shadowed our progress through the evolution of thought. Language. We use language to build. They use it to destroy. Consonant with the mislaid formation of their consciousness, so such a being uses language, not to clarify, but to form his fear-driven outlook, obscure, uncertain, and out of control, without purpose or structure, to justify how he lives. His fuzzy, half-understood definitions can mean anything, or more to the point, nothing, and their insubstantiality leads him and anyone who listens, as usual, to danger. Corrupting language and concept formation serves their tantrum to break cause and effect. If they can mix and match cause and effect, they neurotically believe that they can realize their imaginary world. Because a concept is not a material element like a rock or a tree, they think they can get away with subverting its identity. But such folly has never resulted in the values they try to cheat. This is the only time when they exclaim the great power of the human mind. Their method is simple. They see desirable products or traits in others and detach the benefits from the work expended to achieve them. Then they reattach the benefits to whatever random actions they themselves have taken. They disconnect the guilt, shame, and poverty they suffer and plug that in as a result of the producer's effort in place of his rewards. It's easy. The producer works and gets no thanks for it and no reward, while the spirit murderer is free to remain irresponsible and incapable, gets treated like a king, and enjoys the looted bounty. It may sound like a foolish child's game, and is, but it has grown into the foundation of many religious, philosophical, and governmental systems around the world. Still, it doesn't work, not on an individual level and not on a national level. A man can cannibalize but cannot assume the stature of his victims. He can steal their property, but he cannot reproduce the bounty which he efforts only to take. The productive cannot be drained to serve the non-productive without collapse of the system on any scale that is practiced. But the something-for-nothing mentality respects neither reason nor boundaries. Never having to face reality is too big a carrot to ignore, yet the reality is quite different. Most spirit murderers remain in a state of neurotic dysfunction, angry and helpless, functioning just enough to make it to work each day, grudgingly adhering to the minimum level of civility society requires. There's no way to escape cause and effect. It is what it is. Life fulfillment and emotional health are achieved by all men in the same basic ways and for the same reasons as why we all use the same dictionaries. Concepts are what they are and mean what they mean, regardless of who's using them. They describe conditions of existence that can be encountered by anyone. When encountered, they're given names to differentiate them from all other concepts. To use a concept's name when its conditions do not exist does not bring its rewards about. Yet as we form concepts just as we build homes, plants, and skyscrapers, for use, the immoral man sits back and expects that one day the book titled My Way will drop out of the sky, packed with the definitions that allow him wealth and grand spirituality for nothing, for his guarded lifestyle of total irresponsibility. It will never happen. Sloth by any other name is still sloth, as is fear. Confidence, pride, love, and self-worth are made up of the elements they're made up of, regardless of the names chosen for them. The elements are determined by cause and effect. They cannot be cheated and are not negotiable. The clear definition of virtues places all men on a moral map, showing each his distance to their attainment. Spirit murderers pretend the map shows them sitting upon the crest of virtue in all cases automatically, which leaves him stuck where he is. There has never been proper philosophical separation for the moral sides of concepts in any human language, which only results in confusion. Look in any dictionary or thesaurus, and you will see that nearly every word has a life-serving and a life-taking definition that's supposed to mean the same thing. Every word will have a synonym, which is actually a metaphysical antonym. The expropriation of the benefits provided by the life-serving concept is the motive behind equating these words. Non-thought. Most of the fear-driven use abstraction improperly, if ever. Even what they call thinking is not thinking at all, as you cannot trust their means of differentiation. What anything means is simply what it means to others, and they often only parrot what they hear. A viewpoint derived not from existence but from others does not qualify as thought, or as one's opinion. Thought is an independent process revealing links back to the foundations of existence. His mental content was accepted without awareness of the roots leading back to its origin, and therefore he lacks the capacity to work with the knowledge itself. As the natural enemies of thought, the vast concentration of spirit murderers are limited to the lower levels of cognition. By choice, they share characteristics with early man and with the tribal primitives that still exist today. Held back by will or by nature, little is possible to savages. At some subjective parallel, they believe existence is controlled by demons, subject to the unknown in its very form, where entities can vanish, appear, or mold into a threat, and they leave as much of existence as possible in that category. The elements above simple cause and effect for a 1-2 level spirit murderer are not considered to be within the capacity of man. Their two-piece opinion, however, is its own avenger. To damn with only a few facts has an alternate short-range equivalent, to love with only a few facts. They give their favor without firm identification and vent their dislike with the same willingness to approximate, and wonder why maintaining values and avoiding tragedies are so equally precarious. There's no escape from the penalties of a shoddy intellectual effort. Concepts, dreams, and ideas are always impossible to those not seeking the validation of their premises. Instead, they prefer contemplating the possibility of the impossible and the morally exempt, a process which forms no chain. With a 50-piece puzzle in front of him, he tries to draw conclusions after he gets a few pieces. He wants everyone to pretend that the picture is complete, and that he's justified to move beyond it, and he does, straight into a void. There's no breakdown, no cognitive separation, and no clarification of ideas allowed, just blind approval or renunciation. As we move through our knowledge tree, each new vantage point is a new context, the point from which we're looking at the world. Fear-driven man can't follow, or just doesn't want to. He's reached the limit of his tolerance for abstract thought. Left behind, he reacts to the new conditions as if they're false, seeing them as inconsistent with the old context. They are inconsistent as we're in a different place intellectually, but he cannot, or in tantrum will not, keep up. For example, he sees one link in a chain of knowledge and considers it the whole. He hears a radio program on a subject, feels a bond with a commentator's negative bias, an opportunity to sneer, and considers it a complete description of the event in question. He mimics the commentary as his own, making no attempt to expand on the issue. The introduction of any aspects not discussed by the commentator blindside him. Without the radio program, he wouldn't know what to think, or how. An anti-conceptual mentality will raise wages without expecting the product to cost more. He'll cap consumer prices without regard for the price of energy. Ignoring the big picture, questions his capacity to handle the living process of managing it, or to run the chain, as I call it. But what begins as a lethargic byproduct of cowardice grows into the deliberate and irrational invalidation of sound reasoning, as well as the irrational validation of unsound reasoning. Then you're dealing with pros, and the game can get very dangerous indeed. The fixed and the fluid. The fear-driven simplify standards by not having any. Actually, standards are unavoidable to any human, and theirs are defined as usual by default. Early on, they identify the good as any value experience which requires no effort. The evil is anything they fear and whatever causes them to face it. Often, that's as far as they take it, and naturally, the mind falls into the latter category. Parasitical from day one, believing all are tied to all, standards become not primarily existential, but social, and backwards, they look to their social links to define what is existential. Too lethargic to form standards on their own, they live off what others have created, involve themselves in others as a purpose, and look to others to form their values. The fear-driven typically avoid the physical sciences as the rules are rigid. They do not account for fears and remain unaltered by tantrums, pleas for mercy, or patience, and that poses too many questions. 2 + 2 = 4 has no give. It simply is. It can't be cheated, lied to, or threatened, and this provokes the most extreme discomfort in a spirit murderer. To understand it is to exercise an attribute of self, and the concept of self is their enemy. Science wipes out their whole basis of reality, an unconscionable threat. They intend to negate facts and stick with rootless opinions, so in effect, all standards remain in flux. For the fear-driven, standards of good and evil remain whatever they want them to be, and magically adjust in pace with their own degeneration. An actual standard is a means to gauge adherence to a principle. It places the measurable attributes of an entity along an applicable scale of unit value. An anti-standard is a rejection of the capacity to measure. Regarding one's moral stature, it's a rejection to stand alone, along a scale of virtue. A false standard glorifies his current state as the pinnacle point of departure, rather than permitting valuations where room for improvement could be seen. He feels no need to strive towards an ideal, but to be boosted a smidgen above the stature of others, which too is often a lie. His herd instinct of not outdistancing the pack quells all desires to rise, but relative standards are codependent standards, tools of the unself-worthy. An anti-standard permits no adherence to itself, like moving the basket to catch any wild shot. The outside world must bend to account for their moods, emotions, and tantrums. Imagine them in their threatened misery yelling, "This is happiness! I am happy, damn it!" They have to ignore that problems exist, as the only means to solve them is the enemy they dread, cognition, and using it would reveal what their default has done to their pride. Instead, they claim there is no default, that the mind is capable of anything, that concepts can be whatever one wants them to be, and that there are no fixed means in body or spirit by which a man must live. Close off one nostril, and you know how simply and drastically it will affect your life. Existence matters. From a spirit murderer, you'll hear nothing but approximations about facts and final verdicts about unknowable dementia. He fights to nullify the rational process of validation, the process he fears, in order to fix the impossibility of personal action, but his excuses remain dynamic, as do the accused sources of his own guilt. For a group whose slogan is, "There are no absolutes," they hold as utterly absolute the impossibility to pin any responsibility on themselves. Spirit murderers cannot afford admitting to an accurate definition of good and evil. They wish to allow no clean, rational view of innocence on one side or total contamination on the other. They see no need to go to extremes. In other words, no need for purity and no need to disinfect. Whenever I hear this, I think of the research laboratories or the dust and dirt-free environment of the space shuttle preloading bay. I think of micrometers and other precision instruments measuring phenomena well beyond our sensory grasp. I think of the complex readouts on digital displays, where some minuscule variation can make a roomful of scientists cheer or rise in astonishment. I think of my constant pursuit of pure moral clarity and all it has given me. No need? Another word for extreme in this context is true. Extreme beauty, love, devotion to truth, accuracy, purity, physical awareness, knowledge, happiness, bounty. These are all powerful forces that serve the living. Then again, living is not always one's intention. To avoid extremism in the context of identification is to avoid exactness. They say, we're all just shades of gray, except for the best and of course the worst. To permit no extremes means nothing is quite hard or soft, but remains shapeless and undefinable, reflecting the content of their own consciousness. Such an object, a lifeless, spineless, shapeless blob, cannot be projected like an arrow can. It cannot gather any inertia and never does. Therefore, it poses no threat to the esteem of a spirit murderer. The whole intention of moral armor is to glorify and preserve the spirit of the highest type of human being, the arrow, the self-made man, and his possibility exists only because there is a hard, clear, realistic extreme to aspire to, the moral purity of seeking the life-furthering path in all things. Not to measure each man by an elastic standard, as life does not grade on a curve, but for each entity seeking to enjoy its existence at the height of its own capacity, whatever that may be. A byproduct of this is to publicly shatter any false esteem such proponents of the gray lay claim to. The last grasp they have on the spirit of man, the only power they've ever had, their sacred moral inversion, will fall to me. The game is up. We know what you're doing, and there'll be nowhere left to hide. But there's a big difference in how we'll deal with our enemy. They will not be put to death, as is the ultimate social goal of the fog summoners, but the greatest horror for the spirit murderer, to be put to work in the service of earning their own esteem by civil means. No longer will a cushion be allowed between cause and effect for the immoral. For once they'll have to face the true consequences of their own theories and practice. Those who are willing will learn that there's nothing to be afraid of. Those who aren't will be their only victims. Part 3. Evasive Action. Perversion of Purpose. Madness unleashed respects neither reason nor boundaries. World War II adage. We hear that the good always prevails, but the truth is often the best don't win. They get taken out by weapons that are not in their arsenal. If the only human danger were crude gunmen, burglars, and other easily identified criminals, common law would be enough to safeguard civilization. The real danger is philosophical subversion, the false ideas behind human action in thought, relationships, art, and the social institutions designed for the supposed benefit of all. The confusion suppresses motives one level lower to hide the true premise and intention of either side, that of life or death. This isn't accidental, of course. When an army is in front of a large gun, it will mix with the opposing side to nullify the weapon. This is what the spirit murderers have done with their default. If they can keep it from being seen, they can keep it from being annihilated. Their death patterns are interwoven throughout all living structures, intending to choke the virtue out of them eventually. Sickly enough, in our own moral confusion, by apologizing for our capacity to live, we have woven ours around theirs as well. It's time to choose sides openly. A random thug harms us once. Moral subversion harms us all day long, every day of our lives. These enemies cause the inadvertent worship of evil and a profound hesitation to do what's truly right, especially in regard to independent judgment. Philosophical subversion has us supporting foolish and embarrassing moral premises with many futile and destructive consequences. It has parents wishing for their children's success while unwittingly working for their destruction. The extra effort of reinforcing them with unquestioned moral dogma only serves to hollow them out, making success more difficult to achieve and life's enjoyment nearly impossible. Growing up, I heard the same mindless explanations everywhere I went, the same rehearsed quotations, the same heated theatrics, and the same spiritual threats. I found it shocking that the product of adult minds often became raving lunacy. Struggling with such hand-me-down moral nonsense led me to the discovery of what it was actually damning: life and cognition. With the moral brainwashing I suffered, I remember the extent to which I was drawn in. I'd be driving along thinking, if I adjust my seat back a little more, I'd be perfectly comfortable, but I wouldn't do it. To do anything totally for myself was regarded as wrong, as selfish, so I would delay doing it or try to ignore that I was doing it so that I didn't have to feel guilty. I'd feel guilty about taking extra creams for my coffee. I'd feel guilty for getting a good parking spot, being the first at a light, or standing ahead of someone in line. Now tell me, is this a sound preoccupation for any productive mind? Why did I torture myself? Because I took this morality very seriously, not realizing that insane torture was its intent, and the more introspective its victims are, the more thorough is its harm. The consequences go much deeper than such shallow diversions. They go right to the wall. I see it all the time. People pandering to senseless expectations such as selflessness or sacrifice, trying not to be hit by the opposing accusation of selfishness, accepting its liabilities without question, and submitting to its penalties, rather than thinking their way to freedom by invalidating these false premises. I see irreparable damage done to lives spent masking the neurotic insufficiencies of spouse or family, while their own priceless desires are surrendered to the void. Even the presidents of vast companies, exercising the height of intellectual complexity, have put no effort into an independent understanding of morality and what it does to them. They never ask the crucial question, whether or not the premises they serve are rational, whether or not they deserve any guilt in the first place. The malady reminds me of a comedy I once saw, where two Catholic schoolboys were waiting in line for confession. Divulging their sins, one remarks something to the effect that he masturbated 85 times and told 3 lies. The other boy, being more savvy, helps mask his disturbing problem by changing his confession to masturbating twice and telling 4 lies. Like a crack in the sidewalk, false premises only breed loopholes, a means to cheat the system in order for life to continue, but most are not so inventive. For those without integrity, morality becomes a hustle. For the straightforward, it becomes guilt. Most process the cheating as one more moral flaw, pushing them further away from the actual truth about themselves. The tragedy of individuals trapped under unnecessary stress is rampant, while issues paramount to their self-esteem go hidden and unaddressed. It has put man in the position not to maximize his moral actions, but to lessen the effect of false moral penalties on his life. They have us looping, using our ingenuity to evade a senseless guilt, instead of using it properly to follow our dreams. We're all stuck in the process of mitigation, when at any time we could choose to just drop their code, the unchosen obligations and false burdens, altogether. Otherwise, the resultant manifestations into false epistemological chaining are endless, always degenerating into the senseless sidetrack of deflection and justification on one side, and the gluttonous determination of punishment and value seizure on the other. The fiasco burns energy for no productive purpose, driving the victim to cave in on himself and fry, like an adding machine run amok, while he is stripped of values by his accusers. Does it sound familiar? Like hoodlums keeping your mind occupied while others go through your pockets. It's a vast problem and begins as an exclusive outgrowth of the fear-driven mindset. Enterprise of mind. When a man gives in to fear and reduces himself to a helpless quivering mass, it infects everything he does. The strain of reality never gives the fear-driven a moment's rest, so to him, peace is impossible. As his ideal is a mental state undisturbed by thought, his outward manifestations are simply extensions of this desire. To him, peace is a willing victim, and prosperity is a constant flow of unearned goods. But such gluttony is quickly identified, even by him, as a distraction, and his mind presses on for the true means of satisfying a natural craving, a productive or destructive endeavor. Life allows no negation of purpose. A man's enterprise of mind, his fundamental purpose, is his expression of self-esteem, or his evasion of its lack. If a pointed plan is not chosen in life, random integration and disintegration is the resulting plan. When a fear-driven man is free not to consider life, he doesn't. He contemplates its opposite. For fear-driven man, even dating, friends, and children can all be a product not of personal desire, but of panic over the question of what to do and who to cling to. Spirit murderers start with themselves. His enterprise is wholly in fraud, in a manic interest not to face his core default, and he spends a lifetime building a defense against it. His underlying theme in constant self-reflection is, it isn't true. His only belief in the power of the mind is in the success of his evasions. He says, if existence is whatever I want it to be, then what I did yesterday didn't happen. It's wiped off, even out of the minds of those who witnessed it. I can move ahead with a clean slate, ready for new filth. What he doesn't realize in the folly is that most everything he enacts or supports addresses his weaknesses directly. Consumed with the protection and concealment of his flaws, he works hardest to validate his own futility. He reads the riot act on why goals aren't possible and why his destiny is not in his hands. Let him have the floor and you'll hear how not even tomorrow can be planned, that discipline cannot be expected of men, how they'll squash any attempt at virtue, how morality is hopeless, how ability can't be learned, how no one can know anything, and that men are evil cannibals by nature and the world's going to end any day now in chaos and calamity. What he's actually describing is himself, his hatred and fear for life, and the fragile mental structure he's built. Stop him in his blind fury, and he might see that he is the one with human arms and legs dangling from his mouth. Let him go on, and you'll hear of his illusory jackpot, the sales pitch that all values requiring effort to achieve in our world require none in his. All of our earned pride and happiness is a preposterous illusion, and all of his illusions are a command. His heroics portray not the courage of action, but of inaction, not the beauty of strength, but of weakness, not the honor of rewarding intelligence, but of emanating pity. He need do nothing to meet these standards. Stepping farther, the practice of virtue, productivity, can be considered selfish treason in his world, and all treason a virtuous sign of faith. As no mind is recognized, contradictions cannot be exposed. As there's no process of validation, no errors can be invalidated. His goal is to devise an environment where he can feel significant without doing anything significant. He believes his get-away-with-it mentality has created an alternate universe where he can be powerful too, without representing the virtues required. But the truth is, his world isn't a world at all. To describe any part of it, he must give it form by damning reality as a point of departure. It's the inverse of the world that exists. Nothing more. It's our world minus effort and responsibility. Our world minus honesty, where a man lives not by acts of will, but by wishes. The joke is on his followers. Alluding to a world where one's mind is replaced only spurs the dilemma where one's mind becomes powerless. The abyss. Irrational invalidation. Why is it that the last to be accepted as true is always what every indicator pointed to in the first place? Why does it take so long for anything truly moral or rational to catch on? History is filled with stories of men overcoming great odds, obstacles often put there by other men, and accomplishing the unthinkable. They were fought every step of the way in the name of avoiding unsubstantiated disasters, while the achievers created railroads, factories, power grids, and the electric light. We hear how our acts of creation will bring destruction, a destruction that never comes. We are the evil West, evil because our laws protect the rights of every man regardless of his connections, the connections that determine whether you live or die in those other countries. The best of the West work uphill against howling protests, stirred within those intimidated by our endeavors, while our advances are enjoyed in silence. Everyone forgets the fight, but we don't. Most of us can't conceive of how the population can fall for the senseless, foundationless ravings of our opposition. Can't they see through the malice? As a consequence, we as the self-made are left more desolate, and with a strained respect for our fellow men in general. What if there was a pattern to it? As humans, our every premonition tells us to follow our gut, to discover and name the proper course for our every endeavor. Essentially, in innocence, that's all we as the self-made are doing every step of our lives. The spirit murderer's fear tells them not to follow their gut, and to disallow it to others as well, knowing it leads to the truth, about themselves, about the true purpose of life, and about those they damn. In avoiding proper coherency, we'll discuss some of their key means of invalidation, beginning on this gate.
Hi, it's Ron again. I hope this expose on the pattern of evil serves you well. No one has all the answers, but I know the answers don't reside in religions or in the empirical complexities offered by history's philosophers. The majority of good people out there are too busy to mind the greats, and no one should have to rely on interpretations. A truly powerful philosophy should and can exist independent of its creator. With awareness of the patterns I've developed, you literally need nothing else to guide you. The moral conclusions you'd arrive at in any context would be about the same as I've described. You just get a huge head start with the products I've created, such as Moral Armor's 12 CD set, Sovereignty, a fully functioning, fully integrated moral philosophy based on nature itself. The most effective tool must be simple by design, easy to acquire, easy to use, easy to share. Welcome to a new kind of confidence that you've always deserved, a simple four-step structure to guide our actions which describes the moral pattern of cognition we all follow in pursuit of life, whereas any intentional violation of this pattern is life-averse and therefore immoral. So what can you do now? Click subscribe and hit the bell to be notified of updates. Join ethicsunderground.com. Get on our mailing list so we can stay in touch. Get all 12 discs of sovereignty. Free yourself from all moral oppression with the simplest, most effective moral code ever devised. Protect yourself mentally, physically, and spiritually. Change your fate and that of the world's by acquiring your moral armor. Thank you. For Ethics Underground, this is author-philosopher Ronald E. Springer.